For more than 6 centuries, one family ruled from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula and from the Black Sea to North Africa. Its sultans commanded armies, appointed governors, controlled sacred cities, and lived inside palaces where decisions could alter the lives of millions. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was weaker and smaller than it had once been, but the House of Osman still seemed inseparable from the state itself. The dynasty had survived defeats, rebellions, assassinations, and the loss of entire provinces. Few could imagine that it would soon be removed not only from power, but from the country. Then the throne disappeared. The last sultan left Istanbul aboard a British warship. Less than 2 years later, the last caliph was taken from Dolmabahce Palace before dawn and placed on a train into exile. Princes who had been educated to command armies searched for ordinary work. Princesses sold possessions or married into other royal houses. One member of the family drove taxis and worked in a cemetery. The last sultan died so deeply in debt that his burial was delayed while creditors waited to be paid. The last caliph died in Paris, and his body remained there for years because the country his ancestors had ruled would not receive it. But the family did not vanish. Its members scattered through France, Switzerland, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, India, Britain, and the United States. Some experienced poverty. Others entered new palaces. One Ottoman princess lost a monarchy twice. Decades later, descendants returned to Turkey as private citizens, and a man who might once have lived in Dolmabahce came back through its doors as an ordinary tourist. So how did the Ottoman royal family go from ruling an empire to living without a country? Did they lose their fortune as well as their throne? Who was allowed to return, who never came home, and what remains of the dynasty today? To understand their fate, we first have to understand what collapsed. The Ottoman dynasty was not merely a royal family sitting above the government. For centuries, the state had been organized around it. The ruling sultan was monarch, military sovereign, and, by the empire's later centuries, claimant to the caliphate. Princes were potential successors. Imperial marriages connected the palace to powerful households. Palaces such as Topkapi, Yildiz, and Dolmabahce were homes, but they were also offices, treasuries, archives, ceremonial stages, and symbols of sovereignty. That overlap would matter enormously after the fall. When a crown, a government, and a family share buildings, land, jewels, and income, who owns what when the crown is abolished? Is a palace the private home of the ruler or property of the state? Is an imperial estate a family possession or an asset attached to public office? Those questions had already caused bitter disputes before the empire ended. They would continue long after the family was expelled. By the time Mehmed VI became sultan in July 1918, however, property was not the most urgent problem. The empire was fighting a war it could no longer win. In October, the Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros. Allied forces occupied strategic points and soon entered Constantinople. The empire's Arab provinces were gone. Greece landed troops at Smyrna, now Izmir. The settlement proposed at Sèvres in 1920 threatened to divide even the remaining Ottoman heartland. Mehmed VI faced a terrible choice. He could work with the occupying powers and try to preserve the dynasty through diplomacy, or support a nationalist resistance that rejected the authority of his own government. He chose cooperation with the Allies. Mustafa Kemal and the nationalist movement based in Ankara chose war. The nationalists created their own assembly, raised armies, and refused to accept the partition planned at Sèvres. Their military victories transformed the argument. Ankara no longer looked like a rebellion that could be suppressed. It looked like the government that had saved the country. The Sultan's administration in occupied Constantinople, meanwhile, appeared compromised by its dependence on foreign power. By the autumn of 1922, the nationalists had won. The Greek army had been driven out of western Anatolia, and a new peace conference was approaching. But two governments still claimed to represent Turkey: the sultans in Constantinople and the Grand National Assembly in Ankara. Both could not speak at Lausanne. On November 1, 1922, the assembly solved the problem by separating the sultanate from the caliphate and abolishing the sultanate. Mehmed VI was no longer sovereign. He had not lost a palace through a family quarrel or a temporary coup. The institution that made him sultan had been declared finished. He feared arrest and perhaps a worse fate. On November 17th, he requested British protection and left from the grounds of Yildiz Palace. A small party accompanied him to the British battleship HMS Malaya. From the deck, the last Ottoman sultan watched Constantinople recede behind him. The family had ruled the city since Mehmed II conquered it in 1453. Now its final monarch was leaving under the protection of a foreign navy. Yet even then, the dynasty's removal was incomplete. The assembly had abolished the throne, but it had not immediately abolished the caliphate. Instead, it elected Mehmed VI's cousin Abdulmecid as caliph. This created a strange arrangement. The Ottoman Empire had no sultan, but an Ottoman prince still occupied a palace and held a title recognized by Muslims far beyond Turkey. Abdulmecid II was unlike the image of a conquering Ottoman ruler. He painted, played music, collected art, and moved comfortably in European cultural circles. His new office had ceremony but no independent government. The assembly had selected him, limited his budget, and denied him political authority. In theory, he was a religious symbol within a republic. In practice, his presence kept the dynasty visible. That visibility became increasingly dangerous to the new regime. Foreign Muslim visitors still approached him. Supporters of the old order could imagine the caliphate growing into an alternative center of loyalty. Ceremonial habits around him resembled a court, even when the state insisted that no court remained. In October 1923, the Republic was proclaimed and Mustafa Kemal became its first president. The question was no longer whether the Sultan could return. It was whether any Ottoman institution would be allowed to stand beside the Republic. The answer came on March 3, 1924. The Grand National Assembly abolished the Caliphate. But Law No. 431 went much further than removing one office. It permanently barred the deposed caliph, the male and female members of the dynasty, their sons-in-law, and descendants through the dynasty's women from residing in Turkey. It stripped those covered by the law of Turkish citizenship. It ordered them to leave. For Abdulmecid, the decision arrived before the country had fully absorbed the news. In the early hours at Dolmabahce Palace, officials came with the order. The palace that had once displayed the power of the late empire was quiet. There was no army for the caliph to summon, no government for him to command, and no legal appeal capable of stopping what had already been decided in Ankara. The household was awakened. Luggage had to be prepared quickly. Members of the family and staff said their farewells while police supervised the departure. At about 5:30 in the morning, a convoy left the palace for Catalca, outside central Istanbul. Officials avoided the more public Circasi station, where a crowd might gather. At Catalca, the former caliph and his immediate family boarded a train toward Switzerland. The scene contained the entire reversal in miniature. A man whose title linked him to centuries of Islamic and Ottoman history did not leave with troops, ministers, or a royal procession. He left under police escort, carrying travel papers issued by the Republic that had abolished his office. Behind him stood Dolmabahce, still full of chandeliers, carpets, paintings, and rooms built for imperial ceremony. None of it was coming with him. Other members of the dynasty followed over the next several days. Contemporary totals vary depending on whether spouses, children, and attendants are counted, but roughly 150 members of the imperial family were directly swept into the expulsion, and the actual group displaced with them was larger. They left by rail and ship, often with limited cash, jewelry, clothing, documents, and whatever portable possessions they could manage. Some were elderly. Some were infants. Many had never lived anywhere else. The law turned exile into something more severe than a change of address. These people were not simply being asked to leave until political tension passed. They lost citizenship and were forbidden to reside in the new republic. A family that had once represented the state had been declared foreign to it. Then came the property question. The law distinguished between different categories, but in a way that favored the new state. Family members were required to liquidate their immovable property in Turkey within a year under government supervision. If they did not, the government could sell it and send them the proceeds. Immovable property registered to former Ottoman sultans passed to the nation. Palaces and their contents associated with the old throne were placed under state control. On paper, this did not mean that every necklace, banknote, or private object vanished at once. In reality, hurried exile, weak bargaining power, expiring travel documents, scattered ownership records, and the cost of supporting large households made orderly liquidation extremely difficult. A villa could not be folded into a suitcase. A disputed title deed could not feed a family in nice. Jewelry, when available, was portable and therefore valuable, but selling it turned inheritance into living expenses. Each sale bought time by reducing what remained. Nor was the family's wealth held in one neat account that could be divided among the exiles. Different branches had different mothers, residences, allowances, properties, and marriage connections. Some assets belonged to individuals. Others were tied to a reigning sultan, the civil list, charitable foundations, or the imperial treasury. Servants and dependents also had to be supported. The result was not one dramatic confiscation followed by equal poverty. It was a slow sorting of winners and losers. A few households carried enough value abroad to live comfortably for years. Others survived only because a relative married well, a sympathizer sent money, or one more object could be sold. The first great center of Ottoman exile formed on the French Riviera. Nice and nearby towns offered familiar language, established hotels, and access to European networks. Mehmed VI had settled at San Remo in Italy. Abdulmecid moved from Switzerland to France. Other branches went to Budapest, Beirut, Damascus, Cairo, Alexandria, Paris, and farther still. At first, some believed the exile might be temporary. Monarchies had fallen and returned before. Political regimes could change. The Caliphate still had supporters outside Turkey. A marriage, a foreign government, or a shift in public mood might open a road home. But no serious restoration force emerged. Foreign rulers might show hospitality, yet few wanted to challenge the Turkish Republic for the sake of a deposed house. The family itself had no army, no unified political plan, and no independent treasury capable of sustaining a long campaign. The longer exile lasted, the more survival replaced restoration. There was brief false hope around the Caliphate. Muslim activists and political leaders outside Turkey debated whether the office could be revived and who might hold it. Abdulmecid's supporters could point to his election by the Turkish assembly and his Ottoman ancestry. Mehmed VI, who had never accepted Ankara's authority to remove him, retained his own sense of dynastic legitimacy. Other candidates were discussed in Egypt and Arabia. A Congress met in Cairo in 1926, but no candidate won the broad recognition needed to turn a title into power. The Muslim world was now divided among independent kingdoms, colonial territories, republics, and nationalist movements with conflicting interests. An office meant to symbolize unity became the subject of competing claims. For the exiled Ottomans, that failure closed the last plausible international road back to public authority. The last sultan discovered that first. Mehmed VI lived in San Remo surrounded by a reduced court and relatives who had joined him after the 1924 expulsion. Maintaining even the shadow of imperial life consumed money. He had left Istanbul with funds, but exile attracted opportunists, generated debts, and offered no reliable income. Metals and possessions were sold. The former ruler of an empire became dependent on whatever his household could raise. On May 16, 1926, Mehmed VI died in San Remo. His political struggle was over, but his deaths created one final humiliation. Italian authorities sealed the room containing his body and belongings while creditors waited. The burial was delayed for weeks as his daughter Sabiha Sultan and others found the money needed to settle claims and arrange transport. Turkey would not receive the last sultan's remains. His coffin traveled by rail and ship through Trieste and Beirut before reaching Damascus, where he was buried on July 3 in the cemetery of the Suleimani complex built in the age of Suleiman the Magnificent. Think about the distance between those two images. Ottoman sultans had once commissioned monumental mosques and imperial tombs in their capital. The last of them died abroad, his funeral held up by shopkeepers' bills, and was buried in a city no longer governed by his dynasty. The family members who survived him had to make lives in a world for which most had not been trained. Ottoman princes had studied military command, languages, court protocol, and statecraft. Those skills did not necessarily produce rent money in Paris or Beirut. The women often had stronger family and marriage networks, but they too faced the collapse of status, income, and legal identity. Their outcomes varied sharply. Some retained enough property or received help from wealthy contacts. Some married into other Muslim royal families. Others lived in modest rooms and took any work available. The dynasty did not pass through exile as one household. It fragmented into dozens of separate struggles. Few lives show that transformation more clearly than Mehmed Orhan, a grandson of Sultan Abdulmecid II. Born in an imperial palace in 1909, he moved through Hungary, Lebanon, France, Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. Biographical accounts record him working in shipbuilding, selling pictures in an art gallery, driving taxis in Beirut and Damascus, and serving as a cemetery attendant in America. For a time, he also advised Albania's King Zog. Decades later, he became head of the Ottoman family. That did not mean he inherited a fortune. It meant that, under the old dynastic rule of seniority, he was the oldest eligible male in the family. The title connected him to the throne in memory, not in law. A man could be the genealogical head of a former imperial house and still worry about ordinary work, rent, and burial costs. This was the central contradiction of Ottoman exile. The family name remained famous, but fame was not a bank account. A prince might be welcomed at a royal dinner and still lack secure citizenship. A princess might possess jewels but no homeland. An elderly family head could command ceremonial respect from relatives while holding no power over a single government office. Yet exile also created unexpected opportunities. The same international Muslim networks that could not restore the Caliphate could still arrange marriages, provide support, and connect the Ottomans to surviving royal courts. The most dramatic example came through Hyderabad, then the largest and wealthiest princely state in British India. The Nizam of Hyderabad, Mir Osman Ali Khan, was widely regarded as one of the richest men in the world. In 1931, 2 marriages joined his sons to women from the exiled Ottoman house. Abdulmecid's daughter Durusavar married Azam Jah, the Nizam's eldest son and heir. Her cousin Nilufar married the younger son, Moazzam Jah. For the Ottomans, the double wedding was more than a social event. It placed 2 young women from a fallen dynasty inside one of the richest courts of the age. It improved Abdulmecid's financial position and gave the family a new center of support. For Hyderabad, Ottoman brides brought extraordinary prestige. The Nizam's sons were joining a house that no longer ruled territory, but still carried a name recognized across the Muslim world. The arrangement reveals what the dynasty had retained. It no longer possessed an empire, but it still possessed symbolic capital. Ancestry, religious association, education, manners, and international recognition. Those things could be converted into marriages, influence, and security, though never equally for every relative. Durusavar and Nilufar did not simply disappear behind palace walls. Both became highly visible figures in Hyderabad. They supported education, medicine, and women's causes, while also bringing a more cosmopolitan public style to the court. Their lives were comfortable compared with those of many exiled cousins. But comfort did not restore the country they had lost, and the royal world protecting them was itself approaching an end. British rule in India ended in 1947. Hyderabad was integrated into India the following year. Once again, political change reduced a royal court to private status. Another branch of the family experienced an even sharper repetition of history in Egypt. Sabiha Sultan, daughter of Mehmed VI, had married Abdulmecid's son Omar Farouk. Their eldest daughter, Nesliha Sultan, united the lines of the last sultan and the last caliph. Born in Istanbul in 1921, she became the final person entered in the old imperial register of the dynasty. She was 3 when exile carried her to Nice. Nesliha grew up speaking several languages and moving through an aristocratic world that still treated her as a princess, even though her legal status came from no reigning state. In 1940, she married Prince Mohammed Abdulmecid, son of Egypt's former Khedive Abbas II. The little girl expelled from an abolished empire entered another royal house. Then history repeated itself. In July 1952, Egyptian army officers overthrew King Farouk. The king abdicated in favor of his infant son, Fuad II, and left the country. Because the new king was a baby, a regency body was created, and Mohammed Abdulmecid became its leading figure and then sole regent. For roughly 10 months, Nesliça occupied a position close to that of Egypt's first lady. This could have looked like the ultimate reversal of Ottoman exile. A princess who had lost one throne had reached the center of another monarchy. Her husband governed in the name of a king. Her children belonged to 2 historic dynasties. Perhaps royal life had survived after all. It had not. On June 18, 1953, Egypt abolished its monarchy and proclaimed a republic. Nesliça had now witnessed the end of 2 royal systems before her 33rd birthday. In Turkey, her family had been treated as a possible rival to a nationalist republic. In Egypt, military revolution again made royal ancestry a liability. The crisis deepened in 1957, when Nesliça and her husband were accused of involvement in an international plot against President Gamal Abdel Nasser. They were detained and placed under house arrest. The evidence and wider alleged conspiracy were politically charged, but the couple were ultimately acquitted and forced out of Egypt. Turkish diplomatic intervention helped secure Nesliça's release. The country that had expelled her as a child now assisted her as an adult. Her life makes the dynasty's fate intensely human. Exile was not one event in March 1924. It followed family members into marriages, passports, revolutions, and the lives of their children. Could happen again under another flag. While the younger generation adapted, Abdulmecid II remained the living symbol of the abolished caliphate. In France, he continued to paint, make music, receive visitors, and maintain the dignity of his former office as best he could. His daughter's marriage into Hyderabad eased some financial pressure, but it did not create a path back to Turkey. The international movement to restore him never became politically effective. He died in Paris on August 23, 1944, as the city was being liberated from German occupation. His daughter Durusevar tried to have him buried in Turkey. The government refused. His body was kept at the Grand Mosque of Paris while the family searched for a permanent resting place. Nearly 10 years passed before he was finally buried in Medina in 1954. The last sultan lay in Damascus. The last caliph lay in Medina. Neither was permitted to return even in death. The exile had outlived the men whose offices had been abolished. But by then, the first opening for the next generation had appeared. In June 1952, Turkey amended the exile law. Female members of the dynasty and descendants covered through the female line could return. The change also allowed the government to restore citizenship on application and permitted returnees to acquire new property under ordinary law. The offer came with boundaries. The Republic did not restore titles, privileges, or claims to the throne. The amended law explicitly prevented returning family members from using old dynastic titles such as Sultan, Prince, or Princess in a legal capacity. More importantly, it said that those allowed back could not claim rights over property that had previously passed to the nation under the decrees surrounding Abdulmecid II's deposition or under the 1924 law. Return was being offered on the Republic's terms. For the women, the ban had lasted almost 3 decades. Some returned quickly. Others had built lives abroad and came only for visits. Sabiha Sultan eventually spent her final years in Istanbul. Nesliça returned after her second exile and regained Turkish citizenship in 1963, taking the surname Osmanoglu. The name meant, simply, son or descendant of Osman. It preserved ancestry while fitting the family into the modern system of surnames. The male members had to wait longer. Only in 1974 did a general amnesty extend the same return rights to them. By then, 50 years had passed since the expulsion. Boys who had left as children were elderly men. Men born abroad knew Turkey through family stories, photographs, recipes, and a language sometimes weakened by distance. The law could reopen a border. It could not return the childhoods spent away from it. Return also forced a quiet decision about identity. To live in Turkey, the former princes had to accept that the republic was permanent and that their ancestry gave them no special legal position. Some could do that easily. Others had spent half a century preserving rituals and titles precisely because memory was all exile had left them. Coming home could therefore feel like victory and surrender at the same time. They recovered streets, food, language, family graves, and the site of the Bosporus. They did not recover the political world that had once made those places theirs. Nor did every man rush home. Some had careers, spouses, and children abroad. Others visited but remained in France, Britain, the United States, Egypt, or the Middle East. The dynasty was no longer a household waiting outside the gate. It had become a global family. The most memorable return belonged to Ertugrul Osman. He was born in Istanbul in 1912, a grandson of Sultan Abdulmecid II. He was abroad for his education when the 1924 decree made his absence permanent. He later settled in New York, where he lived for decades in a modest two-bedroom apartment above a restaurant on Lexington Avenue. Ertugrul Osman did not spend his life pretending a palace was waiting for him. He worked in business connected to mining and traveled widely. For years he lived without an ordinary national passport, using travel documentation arranged with legal help. The contrast was almost too perfect. The descendant of rulers who had issued decrees and received foreign ambassadors had to improvise the papers that allowed him to cross borders. In 1992, after 53 years away, he accepted an invitation to visit Turkey. He was about 80 years old. One of the places he entered was Dolmabahce Palace, where he had played as a child. By then, the palace belonged to the state and functioned as a museum. He could have demanded ceremony. Instead, he joined a regular tour group. Visitors moved through the rooms while guides explained the world into which he had been born. Barriers kept tourists away from fragile carpets and furniture. The man who might, under another history, have lived there as a senior prince walked through as a guest. He reportedly preferred it that way. He did not advocate restoring the empire and spoke positively of republican democracy. Turkey granted him citizenship and a Turkish passport in 2004. By then, he was widely known as the last Ottoman, not because he was the final living descendant, but because he was among the last men who remembered Imperial Istanbul before exile. He had become head of the family in 1994, yet he continued to live without a court, civil list, or political claim. When Ertugrul Osman died in Istanbul in September 2009 at the age of 97, his funeral showed how dramatically Turkey's relationship with the dynasty had changed. Prayers were held at the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, often called the Blue Mosque. Government figures sent condolences. His coffin was covered with Ottoman symbolism, and he was buried near his grandfather Abdulmecid II. 3 years earlier, dozens of relatives had gathered at Dolmabahce for the launch of a television documentary about the exile. The symbolism was unmistakable. In 1924, the state had used the palace as the departure point for the last caliph. In 2006, the Republic opened the same building to his descendants so the country could listen to their memories. This was not restoration. It was something subtler. The former ruling house was being reintroduced into national history without being returned to national power. Compare that with Mehmed VI. In 1926, the last sultan's body could not enter Turkey and his burial was delayed abroad by debt. In 2009, his relative was buried in Istanbul with public respect. The monarchy had not returned. Memory had. Neslice Sultan's death offered a similar moment. She died in Istanbul in 2012 at 91. As the last surviving member of the dynasty born during the Ottoman era, she closed a living connection to the empire itself. Her funeral took place in the city from which she had been expelled as a child. She was buried at Asian, on the European side of the Bosporus. So what remains today? In constitutional and legal terms, there is no Ottoman royal family with public status. Turkey is a republic. The old titles carry no official authority, no seat in government, and no claim on the presidency. The family's internal headship is a matter of genealogy and tradition, not state law. As of 2026, that family head is Harun Osman Osmanoglu, a great-grandson of Abdulmecid II. He was born in Damascus in 1932 because Exile had already determined where his branch of the family could live. After male members were allowed back, he moved from Syria to Istanbul in 1974. He became the 46th head of the house in 2021, following the death of his elder brother Dündar Ali Osman. An Ottoman family association lists him as its founding president and family head. It is a cultural and familial position, not a throne. Other descendants live across Turkey, Europe, North America, and the Middle East. They are writers, businesspeople, professionals, artists, and private citizens. Some take an active public interest in Ottoman history. Others keep their ancestry largely private. They do not form a single political bloc, and there is no centralized imperial fortune distributed from one family treasury. That last point matters because the story of the Ottomans is often surrounded by rumors of hidden wealth. The family lost access to palaces, imperial estates, and much of the property connected to former sultans. But the legal history is more complicated than saying that every object was simply stolen from one private household. Under Ottoman rule, the boundary between the sovereign's personal treasury and the state's property could be blurred. Abdulmecid II had accumulated extensive lands registered in ways that later governments disputed. After he was deposed in 1909, assets associated with his private treasury were transferred or seized through a process that began before the republic existed. After 1924, the new state absorbed additional dynastic property. Academic research on the expropriation shows that the argument was never only about greed or nostalgia. It was about the much larger question of where a ruler's private ownership ended and sovereign property began. That distinction still produces court cases. Descendants of Abdulmecid II have pursued recognition as heirs and claims involving thousands of old title records. In 2025, after a case lasting about 15 years, an Istanbul court recognized 71 claimants as legal heirs of the former sultan. It sounded like the discovery of a lost royal fortune. But the ruling did not simply hand them palaces, islands, and estates. It settled a genealogical question: who could legally stand as an heir? Ownership is a separate issue. Claimants must still overcome earlier transfers, the distinction between private and state property, later laws, and the explicit restrictions attached to the family's return. Recognition of blood does not automatically restore land. That may be the most revealing modern consequence of the entire story. A century after the empire fell, the Ottoman bloodline is easy to prove compared with Ottoman ownership. The family survived. The legal world that once connected family, throne, treasury, and state did not. And there is no realistic restoration waiting behind these cases. A court can identify heirs. It cannot recreate the political order that made an Ottoman sultan possible. Family members may honor their ancestors, disagree about history, or use courtesy titles in social settings, but they hold no constitutional role. Even the old claim to the Caliphate has not passed into a universally recognized modern office. What survives is lineage, memory, and argument. So what happened to the Ottoman royal family after they lost their empire? First, they lost political power. Then they lost citizenship, residence, and access to much of the property around which their old lives had been built. They scattered. Some became poor. Some found work far removed from palace life. Some married into surviving royal houses and briefly recovered wealth or influence, only to watch those worlds change as well. Women were allowed home in 1952. Men followed in 1974. Their children returned not as rulers, but as citizens of the republic that had replaced them. The dynasty survived because it stopped being one court and became many families. One generation carried keys to homes it could not enter. The next learned to live in Nice, Cairo, Damascus, Hyderabad, London, and New York. A later generation returned with passports rather than armies. And that brings us back to Dalmabas. In 1924, Abdulmecid II left the palace before dawn under police escort, beginning a journey from which he would never return. In 1992, Ertugrul Osman entered the same building with a group of tourists. The palace had not changed hands again. It belonged to the Republic, but the descendant walking through it no longer needed the building in order to know who he was. That is the deeper story of the House of Osman. Power disappeared faster than identity. The throne was abolished in a vote, the family was removed by law, and the palaces became property of the nation. Yet the dynasty survived in names, marriages, memories, graves, court files, and living descendants. The empire ended, the family adapted, and a century later, the most powerful symbol of that survival is not an occupied throne, but a former prince quietly walking through his childhood palace as an ordinary citizen. If you had been offered the right to return only by giving up every royal privilege, would you have come home? Share your answer and subscribe for the next story of what happened after a crown fell.